Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to present an introduction for JavaScript, at least the basics that you need to know for this class. So the main resource that we are going to be using, especially for reference, and I recommend you bookmarking it and visiting it often, is the Mozilla Developer Network page for JavaScript. If you just search for MDN JavaScript, you should land in something like this. So in this video, I'm going to be explaining the basics that you need for creating data visualizations for the class, especially some edge cases that took me a while to understand. But there is a ton of resources in here that you can go and visit if you feel like you want to actually dig deeper into JavaScript. I actually recommend you if you are considering following a career on front-end development and things like that. So the MDN has a ton of tutorials and resources that you can find in here in the intermediate, advanced, and novice levels. So go and check those out. So the first thing we need to know is that JavaScript is a language that was created for the browsers. I think it was created for the Netscape browser, the original one. It was a long time ago. And actually after that, like many browsers started supporting it. It doesn't really have anything to do with Java. It's just an accident that it ended up having that. You can go and check the history about it. It's quite interesting. But maybe one of the most interesting things is that like JavaScript was a big mess, especially during the Mozilla or Netscape, Internet Explorer wars. Each one was promoting their own version of the language. Luckily, a standard was created called ECMAScript, that I hate the name, it's really ugly in my opinion. And then they tried to organize and standardize a little bit more the language, and that really helped. So this is important to know, is that if you hear about ECMAScript 3 or ECMAScript 6 or ES6, those are different versions of the standard that are like more modern than traditional versions that you will see around. And we are going to be using like the latest one that it's supported by modern browsers, at least at the time of this recording. Now, having said that, you need to know how to actually use JavaScript. So one of the things you need to know is that actually if you have a web browser, either in your cell phone or in your computer, then most probably you have JavaScript in there. Because of that, it's probably one of the most used languages in the world. And if you open this console, then you can start executing JavaScript code. How do you get there? Well, you just need to go here into options and then settings. And this is Chrome, by the way. Oops, it's not settings. More tools, and then developer tools. I always open that with the shortcut, so that's why I was getting confused. So in here, basically, you will find a bunch of tabs that are very useful for developing, especially web pages. And then in here, you can actually execute JavaScript code. So this is quite cool, and this is run after the browser has rendered, and it even allows you to manipulate the page. Like, for instance, I can go and say that I want to select the body of this page and say that I want to change the color to red or something like that. So when I do that, then you can see that all the colors of the page actually change. I wonder if I can change, for instance, the font size. This one is an attribute that has a minus, so I can actually do it like this, and we are going to see a little bit more about that later. Let's say that this is 24 points. Not sure if that's going to work. It actually works. So it's actually, as you can see, I can modify any web page. And that's kind of one of the main reasons why JavaScript was created, is that it allows you to create interactivity and to change a page and to make it interactive. So you can always come to this console and start executing things in there. As you can see, I can start creating basic applications. I use it all the time, especially because it has autocomplete. So for instance, I can go and create a string, and then if I want to know how to take that string to uppercase, and then of course I have to save that into a variable. And if I want to go and check, like for instance, how to convert that into uppercase or lowercase, then you can find the different functions in here. So I found that very useful. So, but that's the first time you don't do development in here, but you do a lot of testing and debugging in here. The other thing is that this sources tab is going to be very useful for you. I'll make this a little bit smaller so you can actually see. Every time you look at a page, you should be able to actually see the source code that it's in there. This one, it's been minified, so it loads faster, but you can even expand it and then start debugging and seeing what's the code that is in there. Like this one is a little bit harder to read because it has been minified, but the important thing is that actually your code is going to be available whenever you're doing things like this. Now, if we want to start building our own page, let's get and do something similar to what we did last time. Like for instance, let's create a new page and let's say this is like demo JavaScript or intro JavaScript. So basically I'm creating a folder. I'm actually in my desktop, and when I get into that folder, I'm going to start Sublime. You need to know how to set up your Sublime. You can check another video that I have created. Just search for setting up Sublime for JavaScript, or I'm going to provide a link. So in any case, basically what I'm going to do here is create a new file. I'm going to save this as an index.html. And then once you have Emmet installed and all the setup for this, you can use this template. And as you can see, it's quite useful. You can actually go and create a whole page just by writing HTML5 and then tab. Okay, so this is a page. Let's say this is a site that has 900 pixels wide, I guess. And then let me maximize this and then come to this, also maximize this, and put this here next to each other so we can see the two things. Okay, so the other thing I'm going to be doing is that I need to start a web server in there. So basically I'm going to be using one that it's called Live Server. It's an npm package. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Node in a minute, but this is going to allow me to run things directly on the browser. So once I do that, then if I'm not mistaken, then I can come here into, and I will have to make this smaller, sorry about that. I think is in here, if not maybe in the port 8000. So if I go to the browser and visit localhost colon 8000, then of course that doesn't work. See what's filling in here. Oh, it's 8080. So it was right the first time. Maybe it was cached. Okay, good. Oh yeah, the problem is that the page doesn't have anything. So of course it's not showing anything. So let me merge these two things again. So the interesting thing is that you already saw that you can create a page in here. So this is the intro to JavaScript. And then your JavaScript will go in a script like this. So one of the nice things about live reload is that it will actually be refreshing the page. So here on this browser, I'm actually seeing the page that I'm writing in here. So I can go and start writing here like any JavaScript code. So I can write something like this, and then when I do that, then immediately get a pop-up. Do not use alert because it's very nasty, and your browser even is going to be starting to complain, but it's a good starting point. So let's get rid of this, and actually let's say that we want to print something on the console. So if you want to do that, then you just say, hola, John, and then you put something like this. Now the problem is that you will not see any result if you just have the page like this. And that's because this statement is actually going into the console. So if you want to see the console, remember I just use the command option I, that it's the keyword for Mac. Then I get into the console. Let's make this bigger. These things actually come from live reload, but basically here is the one that it's saying that the line that I wrote. Okay, so this is the second way of writing code. It's like you write an HTML page, and then I actually come and modify this. So in here I can do the same thing that I did before, and this is code that you can find and learn more about on the Mozilla Developer Network page. Basically what I'm doing in there is that I'm selecting the body, and then again I'm going to change the style of this, and then change the background color, I think is what that is, to red or something like this, and then I can see everything red. That's too red. So I can change something like this. Okay, so so the key here is that the only reason why I can access this attribute is because I'm running in the browser. I also can do that in here, but the third way of running this, it's actually like the same way that you will run Python. It's that there is an application call, and actually let's visit that here. So if you search for Node.js, then this page actually is the homepage of the whole server that allows you to run JavaScript code in the backend. So we are not going to go too much into that, but if you take a look at the documentation and all of the elements, then you can see like here in some guides, like how you can actually start writing code, like maybe here and about. Here is some code from in Node, and then for instance, this is a code that starts a small HTTP server. So it's very similar to writing to Python, okay, with some differences. And whenever you're working in there, you will not have access to the browser variables, like for instance, the document, because you're running on the server. Does that make sense? So you have three ways of running. Two that actually work with the browser, one that it's directly on your code, and the other one is in the console. And the third one is going to be using Node. So once you have Node installed, actually, let me send this to a file. So let's do this and then say, this is going to be into a file named main.js. And then I can come in here and then create a new file. And by the way, notice how when I save that, this immediately started saying in here, hey, I couldn't find your main.js file. And this is also important because if you don't have this console open, then you will not see errors. So keep that in mind, always keep that up. So I'm going to paste that code in there, and then I'm going to save that as main.js. Yes, I want to use that. Sublime immediately recognizes that I'm using JavaScript, so, and then everything works again. Now, if I go in here in the terminal, in the same folder, and I see the files, I can go and say, compile the Node.js file, and then it's going to fail because it cannot find that document variable. So, yeah, but if I comment out the things, then I can actually run this, and it will actually allow me to see the things. You can also, in the same way that you can run Python, you can also run an interactive Python Node server or interpreter, and then start executing commands in there. Again, we are not really going to get too much into that, but it's important to keep that in mind. Okay, so let's get into the basics of JavaScript. So as I show you in there, you can create many different elements. You can say, like for instance, my name equals John, and let's say that I have also a variable age that equals, like, let's say I'm 15, of course, like you can tell by my face. So by the way, what you're seeing in here, like this is ESLint. I recommend you having that installed. Again, go and check that setting up video if you're going to be working locally. Most of the class we're going to be working on observable, so it's either way, and unfortunately by the time of recording you cannot use ESLint in there, but it's very convenient because it really helps you finding errors in your code. In this case, it's telling me that these variables don't have an assigned value, so basically it's important to have that. So let's say that I want to print, for instance, that the name is, and then you say age, years old, something like this. And then as you can see, this is printing that in here. So a couple things in here. This is a string. You can create strings with single quotes or double quotes. Most people create things with single quotes. I am weird and I prefer double quotes. I don't know, I guess because I like writing Johns and things like that without having to escape. You can also use these ones that are string literals, and when you do that, then you can embed these type of statements inside, which allow you to expand and do string concatenation more easily. You can create numbers and float numbers and things like that. The other thing you can create, it's an object. Like for instance, you can say a person, it's going to be same that in Python, you say name equals name, and age, or for instance, again, just to write it from scratch, you can do it like this. So it could be something like this. And then again, I can just console log the person here. Another thing that I usually do when using these console logs is that you can put like a string first, and then, or like you can pass multiple parameters, and then it's just going to concatenate that. So here it's quite useful because now you can see this is an object. What are the different attributes that you can do in there? Objects don't have to have a specific type of element, so it's up to you what you create in there. Now let's start getting a little more complicated. Let's imagine, like for instance, you want to create a couple people, so you can also do that like creating arrays or something like that, and then say that I want the person to be one of the people in my people array. So I can do that. I can have arrays that have different type of data, as you can see in here. So it's not really too much of people, so JavaScript doesn't really care. So as you can see here, I have an array with 3 elements, and then the first one is the object, and the 2 other are these 2 numbers. Okay. If you want to access elements from different arrays or things like that, like for instance, you can say, like just to rewrite this whole thing into something that uses the object, then you can say person name, and the age is person.age. So basically, when you want to access this attribute, you use dot, and when you want to access the other one, you also use dot. So if I run this, then now you can see it's still printing this. And same thing for arrays, you just use square brackets. If, for instance, you want to get only the second element, then you do it like this. Okay, we are going to, you can read more on the Mozilla Developer Network for that. So, but let's get a little bit more complicated. Let's say that you want to start creating functions. So let's say that you want to create a function that it's called @15, and then it takes a value, let's call it d, and then basically what it does is that it returns d plus 15. So when you do something like that, and then you say, for instance, that you want a console log @15 of I don't know, the age, for instance, that is the 15, then you can see that it's returning 30. Okay. So let's imagine that we want to actually print this, but inside a function, that instead of just putting that out there, I actually want to have something that says your name. So for instance, let's say name, and then this takes a person. So now this is a local variable. Up to now, all of the variables have been global. Technically, they're actually inside the window attribute. So if you actually come in here, then you here should be able to find person maybe. Well, that failed on me. Sorry about that. Don't know what happened there, but anyhow. So let's ignore that for a second. And it might be because I'm using live reload. Anyhow, so basically what I'm doing in here is that I'm going to print this. So I'm going to put that in here. And then the question will be, what happens if I create a new variable? By the way, in previous versions of JavaScript, you will create variables using var. I strongly recommend you using either const or let, that is the ones introduced in the, I think, ES6 standard. And the difference between these ones is that these ones have a function scope versus the other ones, or a block scope versus the other ones that had something called hoisting and functional scope that could be very confusing, especially if you're coming from a language like Python. So the nice thing about this is that I can say, again, say the name for a person, and then I'm returning that in here, and then I'm getting this. I wonder if I can access B. No, it might be because of live reload. Let me try really quickly, just with another HTTP server. And then now I have to manually reload. And then do I have access to B? No. I wonder why. Maybe it's because of the new standard. This used to be the case with bars. Anyhow, so let me come back here and use live server again. And then I'm going to reload in here. And then the key in here is that I want to print and see what value has B. Okay, so think about that. So I just call the function say name, and then it has this, but I'm saving whatever it returns into B. So what should be B? So when you look at that, it's actually undefined. And undefined, it's a special type or a special value in JavaScript that is the same value that you will get on a new variable that hasn't been assigned a value. You cannot do that with constants because you always have to give them a value immediately. But for instance, if I create a new variable A, notice that I'm not really giving it like a type. It's actually dynamic typing. Then you can see that A actually also has undefined. Okay, so this is different from actually doing something like this is null, for instance, and undefined is false as well as it is null. But if you actually go and say A, I want to compare if undefined equals A, then you can see that it's false. So this is important because those are different things. So one thing is to have a variable that has a value, but it's null. And the other thing is to have that is the case of null. And the other thing is to have a variable that doesn't have a value, and that is undefined. Okay. Now, let's continue with that. Let's assume that now we want to create a function. Let's remove all of this. And then let's say that we're going to create a function called person. And then person is going to have variable name. That, of course, is going to be John. And then I'm also going to create an age. And that, of course, I am 15. So let's imagine that now I create a person, like this is P1, and then this is a new instance of this. So the question will be, what do I get on P1? So if you do that and you print that in here, then you see that it's returning undefined. So the question will be, what should I return in there? So if this is a constructor that is actually going to help me create people, or like a person, then basically what I could return, it's like I could return the name, but then it will be returning only John. But if I want to return the name and the age, then I could do it just by saying like something like this. Doesn't really work. So, and you don't have tuples in here, although, oh, actually this is interesting. So basically what it's doing is that it's taking the two of them and it's only returning the second one. You can return it as an array, and then in that case it's actually returning as an array, but the typical thing that you do for this is actually returning as an object. And I'm using a trick in here. Instead of saying the name, the hash name is going to be to the name, and age is going to be with age. You can just simplify that by removing that. So if you just say age, then it's assuming that the attribute name is going to be age. So now I have the object like similar to what we expected. So another common pattern, and this is useful for creating attributes, it's having like an object in here that says, like for instance, let's say this is a person. I create now the object in here, or like you can call this like public or something like that, although like in ES latest versions you cannot. So let's stay with person, and then basically what you're returning here is that person. So when you do something like that, now you can see this one is returning like an empty object, and then whatever you want to be available outside, you put into that. Like that's why I wanted to call it public. So you can say person.name equals name. You can say person.age equals age. So this is pretty much the same that what we did before. Now, remember that add function, or the one that say the name. So basically one of the things you can do in here is that you can create those functions. So let's say name, and then basically in here you just say console log, and then let's use string literals, and then you say name is age old, years old. And then now I have a function. This is a function that I'm not using, and that's why this is complaining. So the question is, how do I access this say name thing? Let's imagine that I'm not going to access this. Let's leave them, because everything else that is not outside is actually going to be private. So these are like attributes that are only inside. So if I have that, then what should I do with this? How do I access that, I guess, is my question. So let's put a debugger function statement in here. What this does is that next time I run this thing, the browser is going to go into the sources tab and create a manual breakpoint. So this is actually quite useful for you to debug your code. Like whenever something is, you want to learn what's going to happen in that point in the code, then you can just put that in there, and hopefully now P1 exists. Now P1 exists. So as you can see, P1 is this thing. Since I removed the return of the name, I cannot access that anymore. So if I say P1 name, that's undefined because it is not returning anything. I cannot say P1 say name because I'm not returning that. So if you actually want to return that, then you need to say something like person.sayName equals sayName. And now basically what I'm doing in here, and this is quite interesting, and this is the first thing that is going to be special for you if you or different if you haven't used a function-based language or functional language. So basically what's happening is that I'm assigning to a new attribute called sayName. I'm assigning the function sayName. I'm not calling sayName. I'm assigning the function sayName. So when I'm doing that, now if I think I have to reload this. When I get here, now P1 has a value. And now I actually can say to that function, hey, call it. So this is the moment where I'm calling it. So this is the first thing that you have to wrap your head around. So I'm not calling the function. Calling the function will have been something like this. So think about that for a second. What will happen if I do it like this? What will be here in sayName? So basically it will be whatever value sayName returns this function. And then since this is not returning anything, this is going to be undefined. So let's refresh this, and then as you can see, sayName is undefined. And if I try calling this, it's going to fail because sayName is undefined. So once more, what I'm doing in here is that I'm assigning a function from one name to the other. I can actually put whatever I want in here. I can say fn, and then if I just refresh in here, then now I can say p1 fn, and then call that. Okay. So this is just the name of the attribute, because remember, like basically what I'm doing in here is just creating a new object that I created here. And inside that object, I am returning the function sayName, okay? Which, if I come here, that's what I'm creating. Okay? So let's go back to what we had because it's clearer. Now, one of the interesting things in here is that this name and age are variables that exist inside this function, okay? So this other function that it's also inside, this nested function, has access to them. And basically what this function does is that it creates a closure. It creates a closure on those variables. So let's go and create the other function that we had before. So let's say that we want to say add. And then, like, remember that we had like add 15. So let's take this. And then basically what I'm going to say is just take this. Take the age and then add 15 to that. So the interesting thing about this is that now I can say, for instance, take my person one. I can say here, tell me your name. And then I can come and say person one after, say p1 dot add 15. And then p1 say name. And then when I do that, I have to refresh this. And then I have an error. So let's see what that error is. Say name is not a function. So P1, I'm returning this. Oops. So I should be returning here person. Okay. So now basically what this is telling me is it's doing it's first telling me that it's 15 years old, and then it's saying P1 undefined. So of course I have an error in there. So let's debug that to that point. So actually, is this one in here? Oh yes, like for instance, now you can see this code doesn't exist. So maybe that's why it was giving me that. So it's telling me that there is an error in there because add 15 doesn't exist. And that's because I haven't, yes, that's the code that I'm getting here. So add 15 doesn't exist because I haven't returned that. So if I want to actually return that, I can create that in a different way. I can do exactly the same thing that I did in here. Or the other thing I can do is that I can create an anonymous function and then say person.add15 equals this. So think about that. So basically what I'm doing is that I'm taking this object, I'm creating an attribute to it, and I'm saving this function into that, okay? So when I do that, now this is better to what I was expecting. Oh yes, so this is not really returning anything, so let's do it this way. So that's why I was getting undefined. That's what I wanted to see. So now you're saying John is 15, and then after adding 15 years, you get to 30. That is closer to what I am, but still under. So that's what we expected. And then basically if we go and say we create another person, then and then we repeat these same things with the other person. For instance, here, so let's actually say that we create person 1 and we create person 2, and then we add the name to person 1, and if we say this one in here, then basically what you will find is that there is again a John that is 15. So that is messy because now I have two Johns. So I actually want to change the name John. So you could create an accessor that changes the name, or another option will be to receive a name in here and to assign it in here. However, as you're seeing, ESLint is complaining because when you do that, then you cannot create a variable that has the same name of another variable, that it's a parameter. So there is a common trick used in JavaScript that is to use underscore for that. That is just a convention, but it's not something from the language. So you could have used a completely different name, like parameter name or whatever. But in here it's useful just to say it's kind of like the same. Okay. And then basically it's what it's going to say is that it's going to assign that in here. Now I'm actually going to get fancier, and what I'm going to say is if this thing equals undefined, or actually that's a cleaner way of doing that will be just to say the default value for that will be John. So if I say what is the person, then it's going to go with John, and if not, let's go with Andy. So when I do that, then it's telling me John is 15, John got 30 because he just got a bunch of years all of a sudden, and then Andy got still keeps his years. So pretty much this is a way of creating like a module, like a class in there. I'm returning the object in here. I created a function, I created another function in here, and I'm also creating parameters for the name. If I don't pass the parameter, it's taking the default value. Now, let's get even fancier. Let's say that I actually want to change this function, and then instead of calling it, or let's leave it like that, and then let's say that I actually create another function that is going to set the age for my function, so for my person. So in this case, this is going to be the age, and then basically what this is going to get is the new age, and again I'm going using the underscore in there, and I'm going to modify the value of that age. So as you can see, basically what I'm doing is that I'm creating a function that takes an age and assigns that to this variable, and this variable is not this variable is this one in here. So this is closures. Basically this function has access to this variable. This one in here is just a parameter of the object, so that's a different thing. That's the one that is going to be outside. So when I actually go and say p1.age, and I say, okay, this is going to be 25 because I want to be younger, and then I just call this again. Basically what is going to happen is that now John went from 15 to 30, and then all of a sudden went back to 25. Make sense? So age in here, it's actually a function, whereas inside is actually a value. So this is a convenient function for assigning the value. So I could actually go and say, let's say that I want to create another one that doesn't take any parameters, and what it does is that it returns the age. Okay. And by the way, let me back up for a second. I actually going to change this function. Let's say I don't want to use this. I actually want to use the normal syntax, like the arrow syntax, that is this one. So that one looks cleaner to me. Same thing, parameter, and then what is the return value. But then using that one, and you're going to see in a second why I did that, I'm actually going to create another function that I'm going to call getAge, and then what this one does is doesn't take any parameters, and the only thing it does is that it returns the age. Okay, so when I do that, then I can now say console log age, and then say p1.getAge. I still have access to that because I save it into person, and then I save this, and then now it's telling me that the age is 25. So now I have a setter and a getter. I should have used set in here. Let's put it like that just for the moment so we can differentiate them. And then you can even go further if you're using arrow functions. Then if you only have one line and that line is the return statement, then you can just do it like this. And then I think that looks super clean, and that's very useful. Now, if you want to get fancier, then you can actually combine the two of them. And then you can say, let's go back to this fancy, let's call it fancy age. And then what this does is that it's going to check, it's going to receive the age. And then the first thing it does is that it checks if age equals undefined. If it equals undefined, it means that it didn't receive a parameter. And basically, if it didn't receive a parameter, basically what you want is to return the current age. But if it did receive a parameter, then basically what you should do is that you can actually take the age and assign the age that you took. So this is quite cool because actually it allows me to say p1.fancy age, and then I want to say 12 years old because of my stupid jokes, and then I can go and also use it as a getter. So I can actually go and say use it as a getter without parameters. So so let's say here fancy, and let me put here some comments so I can make this prettier is cleaning my code, sorry about that. So in any case, oh, I wonder if I can, yes, let's do that. John, but at least I created a couple. That helps a little bit. Okay, so basically what I'm doing in here is that I set the age to be 12, and then I'm getting it in here, and as you can see, it's actually working. So we can even go, and this is a common thing, it's that since JavaScript is so dynamic, you're going to find functions like this all the time. Now, you can even get fancier, and you are going to find, like for instance, if you check the documentation for D3, you're going to get to find other functions that are actually setters and getters like this, but they are even fancier, like even fancier. Age. Mike also usually calls them age. And then the things that he does in there is that first, well, you don't need these things because it's only one statement. By the way, let me do something first. So let's delete this for a second. The other thing I want to do is that, and this is a pattern that is very common in JavaScript, especially when you're working with D3, you're going to find that many times you can do something like say set the age and then immediately call the say the name out of that. Does that make sense? So basically it's taking this and then it's trying to call the name of that. However, when you see this is saying like I cannot read say name out of undefined, and it makes sense because set age doesn't really return anything. However, if you want to actually be able to chain methods like that, and think about this for a second, if I want to be able to, whatever this thing returns out of that call say name, basically I want this thing to actually be returning this person. So if I return person in here, that is the actual, the object, like the instance of this object, then I can do these things. And then this is really cool. Like for instance, in say name, I can do the same thing. I can also return in here person. And then just by doing this, then I can keep on chaining. So for instance, I can do that again and then say the name again. Okay. So you're going to find that this is initially, I remember thinking that that was something that you could do with any JavaScript object, but no, that actually has been hard-coded in there, or has been engineered that way. So if you want to make this fancy age to be something that is chainable, like I cannot return person in here because I'm already returning the age, but I can return here person. So when I do that, now if I go here, like for instance, I can go and start creating something like this. So basically I do fancy age, I set the age to 12, and then I get the age, and then what you see in here, like with fancy, I am returning 12. Does that make sense? So basically I'm chaining methods, is whatever this thing returns, out of that, call this other one, okay? So you're going to see that all the time. If that's getting too complicated, go and try rebuilding this whole exercise on your own, and try to think about that in a more relaxed way than my pace. The one I wanted to show you, just to show the even fancier, is that you can start removing things further. So for instance, fancier age. The first thing is that you could say, well, like for instance, if this thing returns, then you don't really need this, because if it doesn't get inside, then you can actually just do this. Now, the other thing is that you don't really need this too, because it's only one statement, so that will still work. The other thing you can do is that You can use ternary conditionals. So basically what you can say is that instead of doing this, I can actually question if this is true, then do this. So in that case, I just return this thing. And then if it is not, then do the other one. Now I have two statements in here, so that complicates things. But you can use a small trick. I wonder if it will let me do it. Let's try this. And remember that I got that error before. So if you do that, then basically what it's going to be doing in here is that it's actually, if this is true, meaning that it doesn't have a value, then it's going to return age. And if not, it assigns the age and then returns the person. That's what that part does, okay? Now, if you're actually having only one statement, then you can actually leave it like this. And hopefully then now you can see this is one line function, that it's actually a getter setter. So Mike will usually use something like this. Not sure if it's writing completely like this, but you will find it like in some pieces of code. It takes a while to understand lines of code like this, but try to think about that. It's not extremely, it's not necessary for the course, but probably you're going to find code like that. Now, the final thing I want to show you, and it's something that is going to be helpful later in the tree, and is that, remember that we were assigning functions? You can actually go and start creating, and let me split. Let's see if I can get, that's not working, so let me do it manually. I think it's here on view, layout, I think that was what I was clicking. So let's get the main JS here, down here, and the intro to down to JS up here. So let's just change the style because I don't like that body to be so close. So actually I'm just going to create a margin of 50 pixels, and then let's say that the font family is sans serif. And then, as you can see, it's starting to look a little bit better. So the other thing I can do is that I can actually go and create a button in here. And then let's say that the ID for this is going to be BTN, and then it's going to say click me. So when you do that, then if you want to create an event out of that, then the way of doing that in here in JavaScript will be to do something like this. First, I find the button. So, and with D3 you are going to use something else, but it's basically the same concept. What I'm doing is that I'm selecting the button, and then once I have done that, then I can create excuse me, an event handler. I know it's an event listener. This listener. Hopefully, actually, I can cheat and then just put that here and then say add event listener. That's what I wanted. So basically, I want to listen to the event click. And then when I do that, basically, I want to put a function in here that is going to be the function that I call when I click. So basically, I can create that function. Let me create it like this. Say this is going to be on click. This is a function. And then what that function says is just do console log like hola John. Okay? So once more, basically, when you do this, if I want this function to be called when somebody clicks, then the normal thing coming from Python that you will want to write is something like this. And then basically what's happening in there is that, there we go. I'm trying to pass that, and then usually when you use functions, you use it like this. And then if you see, if you actually reload this code, add event listener, oh yes, so it's not passing the second argument. So actually that's why it's complete. But when you do that, it's actually not working because this is not returning anything. Let me just say return true here for the sake of it. And then of course it doesn't like that. Here, this is what I want to see. So basically what that's doing is that, let's say that instead of saying hola click, hola John, you say something like button clicked. Okay, so when you do that, then you can see that it's actually saying that the button clicked before I actually click it. And the reason for that is that when you do this, I am calling the function in here. So actually what you want to do here is to pass onClick to the click method. So when you do that, when you click in here, every time you click, it's actually going to be printing a new statement. Like for instance, I just create some difference in there so you can see the difference, and then you can see it's calling that every time I click. So basically the difference between those two is that the first one was calling the function, the second one is actually passing the function as a parameter, and is letting the browser call the function whenever that thing prints. Now that is important because if you actually go and think about this, like if I put something like this, console log before and then after in here. So I want you to think in what order will these things print. If I have that before, button click, and then after, in what order will that print? So tell me that in the survey, and take a look at the other materials for JavaScript if you have more questions.